Hi, I'm FTG, and welcome to my channel where we're going to do another deck tech breakdown. And today we're doing one for Rosala Rael Kingpin. And really, what got me super inspired to kind of theorize a deck for this commander is when we were playing for Good Clean Commander in the second episode that was released last week. But time's irrelevant, so I guess that's not very helpful. But where my friend Austin was playing the Sephrus of the Hidden Ways deck where he was doing crazy stuff with dungeons. And one of the cards that really stood out to me was Rosala Rael Kingpin because when they enter the battlefield, you get to take the initiative. And the initiative is a really interesting new concept introduced by Battle for the Baldur's Gate set. And I think kind of overlooked in a little sense because especially when paired with something like Sephrus, where you're going to be venturing through dungeons quite consistently, taking the initiative is actually a pretty powerful mechanic, and you got a ton of passive value from it. So, looking at that, I was like, well, Versailles Rael, it seems like they would just be a cool commander. It's in Dimir. I love Dimir. Haven't been able to build a commander yet that I've been really happy with in those color combinations, but I think this commander would be pretty much getting there. I don't know, maybe something that I would be tempted to build something for. But that was, I guess, kind of the plug for Good Clean Commander Episode 2. So if you're interested in Commander gameplay, I encourage you to go check that out. But if you don't care about that, let's move forward to talking about the Commander. So I just want to start off by talking about what is the initiative? And so the initiative is a mechanic that was introduced again in Battle for Baldur's Gate where you get to venture into a dungeon called the Undercity. And you can only enter this dungeon if you're taking the initiative. So if you have a card that just says venture into the dungeon and you're not already in the Undercity, you can't enter the Undercity. You can only do it through initiative. And the other thing that really sets the initiative apart, so let's say you took the initiative, you are now in the Undercity. It kind of works like Monarch. So when you have a card that says take the Monarch, you have it, but if another player on the, at your table deals combat damage to you, they take the Monarch. Well, that's the same thing that happens when people take the initiative. If they hit you for combat damage, they can actually take the initiative and now they get to venture into the Undercity and get the value from going through those dungeons. And then let's say they don't have any sort of dungeony mechanics in their deck. Well, how are they going to go through and get value from that if they have no way to venture through dungeon? Well, that was handled through the idea that when you have your upkeep and you have the initiative, you get to go into a new room through the dungeon. So if you don't have any cards that say venture, that is how you can basically venture through. Is on your upkeep. If no one took the initiative from you, you get to just keep venturing through until you complete the dungeon. So I think that's a really cool addition that they have there. And another thing to keep in mind as well is that if you're already in the Undercity, you can venture through the Undercity. So let's say you have a card that says if you deal combat damage to a player, venture through a dungeon. Well, because you already are in the Undercity, you can move to the next room. However, if you were, let's say you hadn't ventured and you hadn't, taken the initiative and you hadn't gone into any dungeon yet, and you had, a card that says venture, once again, you cannot enter the Undercity. You have to enter the other three dungeons that are associated with the venture mechanic in the first place. So I hope that makes sense. Hope I explained that well. I'm sure there are many more of you who are much smarter at magic than I am that can probably explain that a bit more clearly. But that was just kind of something that I just wanted to call out in case, I don't know, maybe something didn't make sense going down the road here. So, to talk about the commander themselves here, Rosala Rael is an interesting commander because it kind of comes in with some built in evasion. What I mean by that is it has death touch. So automatically there, a lot of people aren't going to be willing to necessarily attack you or block your commander because they might not want to lose it to death touch. So I think when you do that, that kind of opens the door for you to do kind of some cool combat shenanigan things where, like kind of like rogues, right? Like if you're running like Dimir rogues, I think there's a lot of cool aspects that you can add to like giving things unblockable or getting benefits from making sure that your creatures are unblockable. And even though they might not do a ton of damage initially, so like Rosala Rael is only a 2/5, she's got a decent like toughness, so it'll be harder to remove her. But as far as like attack damage goes, I don't see like, people necessarily wanting to like kill Rosala Rael as soon as she hits the board, unless if you read the next paragraph, where when it enters the battlefield, you get to take the initiative. And then whenever you attack, target attacking creature gains death touch until end of turn. And then if you complete a dungeon, that creature also gets +5, gains first strike and menace until the end of turn. So with that, it's going to be kind of crucial that you do complete a dungeon and you have some level of consistency for completing a dungeon in order to have that ability to really make like maybe your like 1/2 squishy rogue suddenly become not a squishy 1/2 rogue, and just hitting face for more damage. So from those pieces of this too that I think is like super interesting about like what your commander does is one, obviously the initiative aspect of things, but then the ability to kind of give other creatures some sort of like evasion effects or, damage boost, especially if you complete a dungeon. So looking at this, my main way of thinking of like, okay, how does this deck win? And what does blue and black do really well? Well, rogues, ninjas, blink, recursion. You have all these different options of getting repeated value. So I think when you kind of break this deck apart, one of the key things to look at is what are the ways that I'm going to get repeated value? So you have initiative and like dungeons, so venturing into dungeons, and then access to recursion because you're in black. So that means like you can use animate dead or living death to get things out of your graveyard and do some serious like damage, especially if they have like ETBs. So with that is kind of like the inverse of recursion, which is blink because things aren't dying, but you're still making them re-enter the battlefield and getting those like ETB triggers again. So another thing too that I think Dimir does a really good job of is just, hitting face. Because there are a lot of creatures that are unblockable, especially unblockable rogues, that I think can be really good for kind of combining with ninjutsu. And so when you add in some ninjutsu effects to something that's like the 1/1 changeling that can't be blocked, well, now you're potentially even doubling up on value, right? Because you're going to be ninjutsuing cards out that aren't being blocked and then putting in, a ninja. And then if you have something in your hand or something that you were attacking with that had like take the initiative, you could potentially use a ninja to put it back into your hand so you recast it and take the initiative again. And I think like that could be almost like an alternate way if you don't have like any recursion, any blink values, to use ninjutsu as another way to get like repeated value off of, just combat and ninjutsu effects. So I think that's pretty cool. And then the other thing that I think Demir does a really good job of is disruption. So whenever you have stuff that's like, if you deal combat damage, exile a card, mill a card, because you could potentially be taking something away from your opponent that's a key part of their strategy. So there are quite a few cards that kind of have those effects that I think are, pretty solid disruptors and ways to really annoy your opponents. So worst case scenario, I think you can always lean on like what black does really well for a win con, which would be like some sort of drain effect. So with like Gray Merchant Apostle, try to, close out the game for some, devotion drain power, especially if you're doing like mastery animation kind of stuff. So to review some like specific cards that I think can contribute to like the overall strategy of how this deck can win is looking at things that give you the initiative, right? So one card that kind of stood out to me, especially one that has like pretty potential for, like blink recursion type values is and I'm probably gonna bomb the name of this card so bad, so please forgive me, is Era Korak? Korak? Oh, I'm not even gonna pretend like I was close. Look at the picture, I guess. Sneak. So it's a 4 drop, and it's a bird rogue. And when it enters the battlefield, you get to take the initiative, and it has flying. So I think this would be really good for any sort of rogue type tribal you might be going for, or ninjutsu because it has flying, and not a lot of people have tons of flying creatures. So you're potentially going to be able to deal combat damage to a player just because this has flying. And then if you have a ninja in your hand, you're likely going to land a ninjutsu effect there, which means you're putting this back into your hand and you can recast it to take the initiative again. Another card that I think is going to be really interesting, especially if you're trying to take the initiative a lot, is Passwage Seer. So it's a 4 drop as well, has lifelink, and then when passenger seer enters the battlefield, you can take the initiative. And at the end of your end step, if you have the initiative, put a +1/+1 counter on passageway seer. So what I like about this is kind of the aspect of like getting passive value. And at least when we were playing for the first time against the Zephyrus deck, like none of us had really come across like taking the initiative yet. And so we didn't really think about like, the added value that we were just giving to Austin by letting him have the initiative for so long. And I think like if you can have like a table or some way to hold on to the initiative for a while, the fact that you have some creatures that just get +1 counters or get stronger just because you have the initiative, I think it are going to be like good high synergy adds. So in this case, like it has lifelink, which I think is pretty helpful, especially like if you're going to be doing combat and you might have like some squishier rogues out, maybe don't have a lot of ways to keep yourself protected. So lifelink could be pretty crucial to just keep you alive for a little bit longer. One of the cards that I think is like so clutch, and again, not to keep bringing it up, but in the video too for Good Clean Commander, Austin was just getting so much value, and because he had completed a dungeon, this card, Tomb of Horrors Adventure, it's a 6 drop, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to take the initiative. So that right there is a huge value, but this part here is what made the card like crazy valuable for Austin, which is whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you get to copy it. And if you've completed a dungeon, copy that spell twice instead, and then you may choose new targets for that copy. So there was a time in the game where he cast Soul Ring as his second spell for turn, and then had 3 Soul Rings. And so that right there is going to be paying a ton of your commander tax for you. So I think Tomb of Horror Adventures is going to be such a powerful card for this deck. Um, Another thing too for like cards that can feed into like the unblockable damage or just having those kind of evasion effects that let you hit face is like Changeling Outcast because it can't be blocked. It also can't block, so be conscientious of that if you're holding it back as a blocker. But what I like about it too is it's a shapeshifter. So if you do have rogue, synergies that you're trying to go for or ninja strategies that you're trying to go for, like this can feed into that because it's a changeling. And then this card that I'm probably gonna botch the name for really bad, so apologies for that. But it's pretty clutch as well. It's Yong T Malson. It's a snake rogue. It's a 2 drop, and if it's attacking alone, it can't be blocked. And then when it deals combat damage to a player, you can venture into the dungeon. And so let's say you have the initiative and then you attack with this, you can move into the next room in the Undercity. So if you're really focused on just the Undercity like dungeon value, cards like this are just going to help you keep moving through it pretty quickly. Another card too that I think I don't know, it would be fun to experiment with. It would kinda depend, like, what the meta is like in your play group, and maybe if you come across a lot like, a ton of other, like, blue-black players, maybe it's not gonna be as powerful. But, Vela the Nightclad, she's a 6 drop and has Intimidate, and she can give other creatures you control Intimidate, which makes it harder for your creatures to get blocked. And then when another creature dies that's yours, um, each opponent loses 1 life. So that's just another way to kinda punish people for, like, removing your creatures and stuff like that, which may not seem like a big deal if it's only 1 damage, but, 1 damage adds up quite a bit, especially if you're just being aggressive and hitting people a lot. And so when you have these creatures that are being unblocked and you're just like, heck yeah, I'm gonna go punch your face, even though you've got like, I don't know, 20 creatures on the board because you're making tokens like crazy, you can still get through like the opponent's defenses, right? So that's where like the value from ninjas is going to be really crucial. And Fallen Shinobi, I think, is a card that not only could potentially get you value, but it's a disruptor, right? Because when it deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles the top card of their library. Until end of turn, you may play those cards without paying their mana cost. So you're exiling cards, right? And if you hit people, and sometimes, like, if I exile stuff, like, if I have, like, Gonti, Lord of Luxury, sometimes I don't cast those cards because, like, let's say it's a creature that's a critical piece to, like, my opponent's strategy. I don't wanna risk, like, casting that card that maybe I want it to stay, like, out of the game and not let my opponent have. uh, if I go ahead and cast it, and then let's say they have like Homeward Path and they get it back, well, I kind of just not only paid the mana cost for them, but then I gave them that critical like card piece back. So I think it's important to uh, not necessarily feel pressured all the time to like see these exile effects and um necessarily cast those creatures. Sometimes it's nice to just, get that out of your opponent's library and let it live in exile for a little bit. And so I can see like any sort of ninjas that do those kind of things, like exile a card from a hand, from a library, from a graveyard, and let you recast it. Sometimes I'm happy with just leaving those in exile so they cannot use them against me later. Something else to consider too is like ninjas also offer like card draw and ramp. So I like to think that like Prosperous Thief could be really clutch because whenever it one or more ninja or rogue creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create a treasure token. So that right there is just going to help you like ramp because a lot of the cards that we've been talking about too are rogue creatures. So let's say even you just have Prosperous Thief out, you don't want to hit. Well, you have, like your Changeling Outcast or something else that can still do combat damage and make you treasure. So I see that being just really valuable. And then outside of like ninjutsu shenanigans and stuff, again, trying to go for repeated value effects, you have things that enable like blink and recursion. So Displacer Kitten is a new card from Battle for Baldur's Gate, and I'm sure if you've been playing Magic, this card has probably popped up in one shape or form to give you like much sadness because it is a very powerful card. But Displacer Kitten is a 4 drop, and whenever you cast a non creature spell, exile up to 1 target non land permanent you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So you basically cast a non creature spell and then blink. Like, that's pretty sweet. And another card too that I think could be really clutch for this is Thassa Deep Dwelling. It's an indestructible god, and as long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, it's not a creature. So that might be a good way to just keep like this effect protected because there's stuff like Deadly Frolic. So maybe as soon as Thassa becomes like a creature, someone's just gonna exile it. So sometimes like your gods not being creatures can actually help keep them alive. Um, but the piece of this that is going to give you obviously like the most value for what you're looking for is at the beginning of your end step, exile up to one other target creature you control and return it to the battlefield under your control. So I like to use like these kind of blink effects for a few different things. One is to get repeated value. So if you have stuff that lets you take the initiative when it ETBs, it's nice. But let's say you attacked with a creature like your commander or something, but you also want a blocker. Well, Thassa can like blink your commander, let you get that take the initiative ETB, but then it's also like untapped, so now it's a blocker. So it can serve as a few different things. And I think its last ability here, which is pay 4 mana and tap a target creature, that can be really powerful too to either tap down an attacker or a blocker so you can go through and hit face. So there's a few ways that like Thassa just really fits with this overall like theme that I think could be super powerful. And then moving on to the graveyard stuff, right? How are you going to get value from your graveyard? And I think one of the things that makes Rosala Rael kind of a bit like tough to work with, I think, as a commander is just how much she costs, right? She's a 5 drop. And so if you move, like, I don't know, like remove her like 2 or 3 times. Like, you're making that a very, very expensive commander. So if your whole strategy is just based on taking like the initiative in the dungeon, that's going to put you in a really tough place. And I think that's something that like when I was playing General Ferris and my friend Austin was playing Sephiroth is those decks, like the whole strategy is really dependent on what the commander is doing. And so if your commander keeps dying, and let's say like, okay, Rosala died, and now I have to pay 7 mana my next turn to rebuild my strategy and my board, that's a lot of mana. And it kind of puts you a turn behind everyone else because let's say another board wipe happens, and now it's going to take like, you might not even have enough mana to recast your commander. So I think stuff like when you can cheat out commander costs in your strategies are so important, especially if you have access to like recursion effects or just black in general, because maybe you don't have to like use something like animate dead or living death to get your commander out. You might be able to use things that are like faint death or Kaya's ghost form. So when it does die, you have a way to just like bring it back right then and there. And you're going to get those like re-enter the battlefield effects from it as well. So I would heavily like invest in some level of like reanimation just to help cut your commander's cost alone because I would not depend on this commander being recast like from a command zone maybe more than 2 times because that's really really pushing it. So that's just my 2 cents on that. But I think too that kind of brings in like the good concept of like whenever you do make a commander deck, I think there are a lot of really powerful cards now that like every card potentially in the 99 can be a threat. But again, it kind of puts you in a tough spot if your commander is like your main strategy, if that is your main win con. And if that's the case, you want to try to find cards that can be like a good backup commander. Because again, if you lose that commander or it's just too expensive to like cast, and that throws your whole strategy out the window of like how you could potentially win, like it's going to be really, really tough for you to get back in the game and maybe have fun. So, yeah, find cards that are good backup commanders. Like, I think in this deck, a really good backup commander is going to be Satoru Yuma. I'm gonna sorry, botch this again. Satoru Yumazawa, because uh, it's a spooky ninja. I'm sure most of you have seen this card and probably dread it, especially if it's the commander at the table, because you're like, oh great, someone's gonna blight steal me to death. But for those of you who don't know this commander, it's a 3 drop, or I guess in this case, this would just be your backup commander. Whenever you activate a ninjutsu ability, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This ability triggers only once each turn. You're like, well, I'm not playing a ninja deck. And I'm like, yes, okay, I get that. But what's going to be the key part is that last ability that you can do, which is each creature card in your hand has ninjutsu. And so the reason why I think this could be potentially a really good backup commander is because you can ninjutsu in cards that let you take the initiative and try to recycle that value to keep going through the dungeons, to keep venturing, and just keep up the pressure on your opponents the whole time. So I think like with what I'm looking at for Rael, like what do I want the most from this commander? It's not necessarily going to be the +5 attack, it's not necessarily going to be the first strike or the menace that it gives another creature. And while those things are really nice, I think like the main value piece that I'm really getting out of Rosala Rael is probably taking the initiative. And so what can Satara Umawaza do? Well, it can potentially give you repeated value through ninjutsu, right? Repeated value of getting those cards that give you the initiative and putting them back in your hand and having them re-enter the battlefield, especially if you don't have any like recursion effects or your blink effects got shut down. Well, here you go. Hopefully, this is something that can help you kind of figure out another way to recycle value, if that makes sense. But sorry if this was a long video overall, but I really had fun, like, kind of analyzing this commander, and I hope you found this interesting or somewhat helpful. I'm really, really curious if you have this as a commander and how it's been for you. If there's any cards that you recommend or things that you think I said, like, well, you tried that and it didn't work out well, I would love to hear those and any sort of feedback just in general of what your experience has been with this commander. So thank you so much for hanging out and have a good one. Bye.